going to have a wonderful session now with three experts, and I'm going to try and disrupt as much as I possibly can. So could you please help me to blow things up a little bit? Because that's what I do. That's the game I play. No, it's just basically that we need to be able to think in a fresh new way, and as we go forward into this world. Okay, so our three esteemed guests, we have Jörg Tondorf, who's the transport planning lead at Arup. He was a speaker yesterday also. Please join us. And Ed Forrester, he's the future mobility planner at McDonald's. Please, if you could join us. And engineer Bijan Majdi, also joining us. I'll go into that corner if I may, and that's about it. Yeah. Okay. So what I'm going to request each one of our esteemed guests to do first, please, is to just spend about a minute or so, minute and a half, explaining who you are and what's the key thing that you'd like to be engaging with during this conversation. For you? Yeah.
Well, my name's Jörg Tondorf. I work for Arup.
Actually, could you just hold it, Ed?
Make sure
so we're going to shuffle. Yeah. We're playing musical chairs here. We're in the wrong place. Jörg goes in the middle, and Ed goes at the end, and Dr. Bijan comes here.
Could have tested if anybody notices.
Nobody saw that, right?
Very good.
Okay. So you, sir, why don't you start? 1 minute, 1.5 minutes about yourself and about this project.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bijan Majdi. Despite my name, I'm an Italian native and citizen, living in this region for 14 years. I have over 30 years of industry experience. I started with 10 years in the IT industry, 5 years in America. And then I moved to the automotive industry. I started with Fiat Auto as the head of after sales for all the brands in Europe. I was 35 and I had hair, and after a year with them, I lost it all. I couldn't see anymore, but I'm still alive. I moved then to manufacturing. I started some startups in Shanghai with Manuri Rubber. I moved from the Indians in the Western fashion surrounding the fort. I moved from being a cowboy to become an Indian selling spare parts and manufacturing them. So supply chain, so I went to the greasy part of the business. So, and after that, in 2000, by the way, I'm not a millennial. My kids are millennials. I moved to telecommunications and startups. I even became a CEO of a telecom startup when the regulation hit Italy and Europe. So I have also that part of the background. And then the rest is history in the GCC. My job is to set up companies, to do merger and acquisitions, to do turnarounds, and to do what we nowadays is very hot topic, digital transformation. In the old times, we used to call bring an ERP system to the company and make things work. Okay. So this is a little bit of my background.
Super, thank you very much. A lot of experience there, and I'm going to challenge Engineer Bijan as the discussion progresses, whether your experience is a benefit or does it get in the way? Because it does sometimes, because you have too much of the rear view mirror, you can't look forward because you get stuck, and I've met a lot of people, and perhaps you will explain some of the challenges that we have in this process. Jörg.
Thank you. Well, you've got the name and the title up there now in the right place. I think what's probably more interesting for you is where I'm coming from. I did start my career in transportation planning in a little bit in computer science, transportation modeling, forecasting. Now, the reason why I think this is very interesting is we now talk about issues around uncertainty, not being able to predict the future. And that is a big problem in our business when you want to actually forecast, and particularly when you have often decision makers who want to have one number. They want to know, is it good or bad? Is it positive or negative? And that's why I'm very interested to actually move a lot more into this new mobility, future cities, spectrum and try to understand what is actually going to be happening in the future. And that is really a lot of things I've been doing in this area, been focusing on it. We've been doing some internal research, and I hope I can pass some of that on in this session.
Thank you very much. I think uncertainty is a key element that we'll talk about. If you remember that curve, the technology curve, when you move that fast in that curve, uncertainty becomes a really, really critical factor, because we now perhaps have to plan differently. And I was in Oman helping the Omani government for their next 25-year plan, and they were planning 5 years at a time. And I said, folks, this is not going to work, because it doesn't work in 5-year blocks anymore. It actually works in much, much smaller blocks. And this is the sort of thing that we need to become faster and more agile in our thinking. So we'll certainly do a deep dive in there. Ed.
Good morning. My name's Edward Forrester. I work for Mott MacDonald as a future mobility planner. I've been in the Middle East for approaching 10 years now. And, I'd like to sort of talk today a little bit about, as Jörg mentioned, the future is a little bit uncertain, but the future's always been uncertain. Perhaps the tools and the techniques that we've had as transport planners are changing a little bit, but the principles are always the same. And, we should be responsible in the innovation that we're applying into our cities, and particularly in the face of climate change and global warming, we in this room have the sort of power to influence the decisions that we make and what the future will look like.
Thank you very much for that. Now, I started with my early presentation with one word. What was that first word I started with? Anybody? Trust. How do we build trust? Thank you. How do we build trust in the automobile, in the mobility, I won't say automobile, in the mobility industry as we go forward? Bijan, what are the kinds of things that help us to build that trust, and that we'll trust the algorithm that's driving the self-driving car, we'll trust the automation that is going in there? How do we build that?
You don't build that. It comes by itself once all the planets are aligned. And it will take time. You just use a bicycle. I mean, I've lived in Amsterdam, and I think that's the best way to do it. And you don't want to be on an autonomous bicycle. Look, if you're referring to autonomous mobility in specific terms, it will take a lot of time to build trust. But, mobility, autonomous driving is not new. I mean, in big agricultural countries, GPS-based autonomous tractors are there for the last decade. And autonomous is the son of automation. And automation is where you deploy automation. When instead of doing a boring, repetitive, mechanical job, you introduce automation, flying a jet, being on the assembly line, and that's where robots came in. And the first robots were stupid. I mean, lower than the cockroach that you were referring to.
That's right.
But then automation is when the machine has an element of decision making. Again, it can be a mechanical decision making, what if. So look, we're using tractors in big hectare, and they're going unmanned. The first application will be, I believe, in the fashion that we are talking about it, for long-distance commercial transportation, especially in countries like America, Brazil, where you have long roads and the driver falls asleep, it's a long road, and you don't have to interact with too many obstacles. So that's where we're going. And trust there will be very, very quickly utilized once the technology is enough to do the job and the regulation assisted. But having that poor lady in Milan, I'm Italian, or in Naples, if you really want to scare the hell out of her, well, it will not work very soon. It will take time, but not just because of the technology, also because of the regulation and the regulator.
Yeah. Thank you. Trust is not just about automation and self-driving cars, and I'm just talking about the industry. Trusting the the decision-making criteria that you perhaps and you, Ed, can dive in. Because we'll make the conversation more open now. What are the kind of things that will help these folks here to trust the work that you do? What is the kind of input that you're putting into your thinking right now? Since you are a planner, you are looking forward. What are the mechanics and dynamics and the data points that you're using now to do that, to build that?
If I may start. So I think the important thing is when we talk about trust is just to think about how do we build trust if we meet a person in a social environment. It's all about, it's about listening, it's about understanding, about informing the other person, the other group about what you want to do, about transparency. It's about openness, about integrity. And these kind of things that we have, that we use in a social kind of circumstance, we just have to transform them to our piece of work. We have to be open. We have to be clear. There's a term that's being used a lot in our industry, which is called the black box, where basically you end up with putting some information that you've collected about people's behavior, about traffic, into the black box, and then you get a number at the end out of the black box. That is probably the worst thing to do if you want to build trust in what you've done in your decision-making assistance or in your plans or in your proposals. It needs to be much more open. And one way we can do that is by, for example, looking much wider, looking at what are the complexities, actually being open about that. We totally understand that the future is unpredictable. So for example, we could go and say, we cannot give you, as a decision maker, this one number. It's simply not impossible. I'm not able, there's too many variables. I can give you a spectrum, I can give you a range, and maybe that is something where you might be buying into much more easily. It makes your life as a decision maker, as a government, as a financer, probably a bit more difficult, but at least I can give you a bit more kind of assurance that we're going to be operating in a certain scale. Simple thing is, example, how many lanes do we need on a new road if you really want to go to building new roads? But that's one of the elements, and I think Ed can probably...
I think that's fine, but I'm trying to build a little bit more on the human aspect. What about, all the artificial intelligence engines and so on and the rate at which they're happening, they'll be far faster than us in terms of analyzing basic data. So I think that's going to be history. So what do we need to build to be able to understand the overall holistic views of human need, societies, that kind of environment? What are we doing about that? Because AI is going to do all the analytics for us. Ed, do you want to have a quick comment on that? Is when you're building future cities, when you're looking at that, how do you look at the human side of it?
First of all, I think that the trust isn't really helped with the smoke and mirrors that there is in the industry right now. There's a lot of talk about, level 5 being around the corner, and the video that you showed about the lady in Tesla being in an autonomous car. It's not an autonomous car. Tesla do not have an autonomous car. They've got an autopilot function that basically means it's like an adaptive cruise control. And it's misleading because they call it an autopilot. And I've been in car showrooms and they've said, we do have a level 5 autonomous car. And so then people trust that, and there was an incident not that long ago in the States when someone moved into the passenger seat after he put it into autonomous mode because he thought that's what it was. But actually it's not. So I think that trust really... what we can do, I suppose, is as transport planners is provide a level of independence when we look at some of the technology companies and the technology that's out there. And I think you have to kind of work with the governments and our clients to help them understand that perhaps it's not quite what it seems, and trust that we can be responsible in the decisions that we make. Sometimes that starts with a little bit of scenario planning, so you might outline all of the possible kind of futures and the different ways that you can go, and perhaps start sort of closing down some of those ones that aren't going to happen and aren't that likely, and start sort of choosing the path that you want to go down.
If you guys remember the chart that I put of all of the industries that are getting disrupted, and the automobile sector, the mobility sector is certainly one of them. My key thing, and just one final word on trust, is that all of these companies, all of the companies they are there to make money. not to do anything else effectively. So, so can we trust organizations who are with a fundamental need to make money rather than being responsible? How do we balance that? I'm not being a socialist here. I'm just trying to find the reality of it. Is that how do we balance trust and ethics on the one side with making tons and tons of money? I'll give you an example. Facebook, who are sort of digital gangsters now, effectively, in Australia, they were collecting a data set for children who were 11, 12, 13 years of age who were depressed, so they had sad faces. They got that data set out, and it sold to the animation companies, to gaming companies, to food companies, because these kids were vulnerable, and they would buy anything. They got caught, they were fined $7 million, but that was it. And it's not even a rounding error for them. Where I'm going is, can we trust companies like Facebook, for example, whose only purpose is to make money? And then that's how they sell it. In this case, they got caught. So in the mobility sector, what are the kinds of things that these corporations are doing? Are they going to slow us down in terms of carbon emission? In other words, keep pushing it forward because they make more money like that? Are the insurance companies going to keep blocking us and say, no, I think we'll still insure it like that, even though our the actuarial work is going to bring us down? Those kinds of things. Is this interesting? Yeah, because I don't think we normally ask this question, so perhaps you can comment.
I will try to elaborate.
Okay.
First of all, we're engineers. You're asking
ethical question?
Ethical questions. Okay, let me answer as a Volkswagen engineer would answer. It was not us, it was the Italians.
Yeah.
I'm referring to the diesel scandal.
Yeah.
Look, first of all, even the non-profit organizations work for money. The only difference is that the profit that they generate, they have to reinvest it into the company.
Indeed.
So everybody in any function.
I'm not against
doctors,
money. I'm just
everybody
saying
works for making
motivations and incentives.
So in our industry, in the automotive industry as a broad industry, including the financial services and the telecommunication, because these are the backbones. I mean, it's not that this is floating in the air. Most of the trust element is, in the technology, is determined by the regulator. I'll give you an example. In Europe, diesel became a phenomenon that it became with over 55% of the circulating cars are diesel, commercial or 100%. This was not purely a technology decision. This was a legislator decision and tax decision that says tax, the cars are paid this, the tax, the diesel is half the price of petrol, and there's less tax on a diesel car. So basically, the manufacturers jumped on it because they said the consumer wants diesel, but the consumer didn't want diesel. The consumer just wanted have less cost of ownership, less initial cost. So the consumer didn't really decide to go for diesel because it was environmental, clean, and the manufacturer went only because there was more demand, but it was generated really by the legislator. And the same legislator killed it now, but it took them 30 years to create it. Now he's killing it in 2 years because building, it takes time. Killing is very instantaneous. Sure. It takes 9 months for us to be born, but somebody will, when we die in a matter of seconds. So trust is intrinsic to the ethics and the regulation of each single entity and company and individual that works. So the automotive industry is very trustworthy because it's very well regulated when it comes to safety, security, crash tests. I mean, we are very well regulated. So it's intrinsic that if we pass all these checkpoints and we put a product or something on a market, well, it's trustworthy because there are so many entities regulating and controlling it. Much better than being a lawyer or a banker or a doctor, a physician.
Yeah, I mean, there's one. Okay, well, thank you, Bijan. Please.
My name is Daniel Audagic. I'm coming from AV Living Lab, and maybe I will just add something to the trust topic. So Living Lab is where companies bring technology to cultivate it in interaction with people with one purpose, to gain trust, which is not overnight thing. And what I would like to share with you is, are you familiar with Talking Tom mobile app? Talking Tom, this was a famous. So this company is headquartered in same area where we operate. And we built 3 ecosystems. One is the business ecosystem, where is this Talking Tom and other companies. Another one is technology ecosystem. So we have a lot of IT companies, a lot of vendors in this environment, and we have workshops, we have design thinking workshop, we do hackathons, all kind of stuff. And then we have also social ecosystem. So within our environment, we have a non-profit organization working with elderly people. So there is like more than 1,000 elderly people. These are former doctors, lawyers, directors, everybody who want to be active. But we also have a daycare center for kids. So imagine 100 kids playing around, and then we have a mobile provider of Talking Tom, who can come to different segment groups, asking them about feedback about the product. And they do the design thinking workshop with kids, and parents are happy that kids are involved in innovative project, elderly.
Yeah.
And this is how they basically are refining the app. It goes back to the development team and work to basically gain that trust. And the question is, because I'm not familiar with this region, are you having ecosystems? Are they managed? Are they talking to each other? And how companies can access to them to improve their products and services.
Thank you.
And gain trust.
Long question, but a very meaningful end. Are there any ecosystem, Jörg, perhaps you can comment on this, in this region that actually address these type of elements? And please, I'll go at the back.
Well, I can talk about one example, which is an initiative led by the RTA, which is around self-driving. They've launched a challenge, I think about a year and a half ago, to get the industry to come over here and to demonstrate their products at a high level first, and then the next step is to actually come out here and actually start testing them. So there's an environment, and that would be like a test site. And the reason why I want to talk about this example is, and it's also linked to what I think Jaime was talking about yesterday, is in order to get trust, in order to get new mobility forms, new technology introduced, we need to start to throw it out there. We need the initial users. We need pilots. We need some people to test it, as we just talked, as was just discussed. Get some feedback, optimize it, improve it. You will not have the final and the best and the perfect product out there. The other really interesting discussion that's currently ongoing around the autonomous driving is that every time, I mean, you mentioned every time there's an accident, it's big in the news, and it's. And people always say, "Oh, these vehicles are not safe yet. We can't actually let them out on our streets."
Thank
well,
you.
at the same time, we have the situation that actually, if you compare the accident per mile driven, you have a significant reduction in accidents. So we need to understand that if there's a benefit and if there's an iterative approach to introducing new technologies, new systems, we will not have that full trust at the beginning, but we need to start somewhere. Otherwise, we'll never get the end product.
Yeah, I think the self-driving transport challenge is a good example. It's actually worked on that project, and we talked about cycles of increasing complexity. So you'd start off with the technology in a completely controlled environment, close it off from the general public. You'd introduce all sorts of safety measures, and you demonstrate the vehicle in real-world scenarios. And then you slowly take away some of those engineering control measures, and you start to introduce people actually using the vehicle, and you build up your sort of safety case until, in the States, they actually grant a license for the vehicles that can operate in real-world conditions off-site before they're then allowed to go on-site. So there's already that level of trust before it kind of gets to the road. And then in the States, I think there's something like 60 autonomous vehicle providers. Don't quote me on that number, but they've proved the technology off-site, and they're now able to operate their vehicles on-site under the permits that are given by the DMVs in various states.
Thank you. Thanks, Ed. We have Lorraine here from Alpha Time. Lorraine?
Hi guys, I hope this is not too disruptive. I've got 2 points to make.
Please be disruptive.
The one is, today Uber have been found not liable for the death of a 49-year-old lady in Arizona in a driverless car, but bizarrely, the second backup driver, which happens to be a human, may still be liable. So from a trust point of view, it's fantastic that you engineer these things. I have no doubt that you engineer them to work properly, but I don't think at all the humanics and the trust element's been taken into account, even remotely properly, because everybody's so excited about getting the first car that can drive on its own. And my second point is, thanks to my learned colleague, I've just found out I'm a silver tsunami, which is wonderful, and I'm going to live another 35 years. So I hope you don't forget that some of us love driving cars with a very heavy right foot on an open road, and we would still like to take into account that in 35 years, I can still go and buy an F-Type, drive it myself, and have great fun. And you won't have removed all the roads from me completely. So please bear in mind those of us who would still like to drive.
Thank you. Lovely questions. Thank you, Lorraine.
Yeah.
And you know, both of the questions are very, very human. And just before you answer them, just to get the audience involved and just calibrate the audience, how many people in this room are engineers? Most of them, ouch. How many people in this room have a degree in anthropology? One, brilliant. There's the single one in the room. Normally I have 500 people and there's not even one. Anybody who has a degree in psychology? Yeah, brilliant. Anybody who has a degree in ethics or masters or something like that?
Masters, yes.
Bioethics, but in ethics?
Ethics, it's intrinsic in what we do.
I'm not so sure. I am not so sure, and that's exactly why I'm. So one of the things when I bring it out later is actually to talk about what are the new qualifications that we need. Engineers now need to go and look at a next step and do bioethics, to do anthropology, to look at other kinds of to get a bigger, greater feel of the kind of question Lorraine has just asked, which is, are we really, really thinking about the human element, the ethical component, at the time when you are planning, you're doing your M&As, and you're doing your future stuff? Do you really build that into your structure?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, just to talk about your second point there, which was, people still like to drive. I'm not convinced that we'll ever get to the point where they'll take away the roads and autonomous. You get in a car and you push a button and off it goes. And that may happen in some capacity, but I don't think you'll ever sort of fully take away the steering wheel from the car. And the reason I say that, even Waymo now, who are beyond doubt the industry leaders in this space, have admitted that level 5, where a car is fully autonomous under all conditions, is not very likely. So you still need those redundancy systems in the event of a cyber attack, or in the event of heavy fog or heavy rain, or whatever it is that means that vehicle cannot operate in a fully autonomous mode. So that means that some of the changes that are being sort of predicted a couple of years ago, when the hype cycle for autonomous vehicles was maybe at its peak or coming up to its peak, with lane reductions and building buildings much closer because you don't need to account for visibility around corners and things like that. You still need to have those redundancy systems to allow for the human factor, and humans will probably always need to drive.
So one of the things we are stuck with is at one level, and Lorraine, you even asked that question, but the future is not at one level.
No.
The future is like that, because as the drones come in, and actually traffic will go down because you'll have your layers and you'll just come in and just fly out. So you can have a nice little drone and you go out in your drone. But seriously, are we thinking that through like IATA, like the air traffic agency?
Yes.
Brilliant, because they are extremely well regulated.
It will not work though.
It will not work?
No.
Oh, okay.
It will happen, and my presentation actually starts with that later on. It will happen because, look, our infrastructure is not designed for smart mobility. Our infrastructure is designed hundreds of years ago, depending on which infrastructure. I mean, roads, bridges, and stuff like that. So the number of vehicles that are pouring on the road, and today we are almost 2 billion vehicles on the road. it's not sustainable. So you have to go vertical. You have to go and you have to really actually stratify air and go by channels and by creating funnels and put DHLs in these ambulances there, the fire control there.
And Elon Musk is boring. He's going under the
Those
skin.
were the pedestrians and the skateboards.
Yeah.
So, but the reality is that even if you verticalize and three-dimensionalize roads and starting flying, it will not be enough because the number of vehicles, if you put the capability of the 2 billion vehicles to fly, you see the number of airplanes that are today circulating in the world are in a range of 100,000. And it's already a mess. If you start putting micro, every individual, no matter how you regulate it, there is no enough bandwidth.
Okay.
So some regulation again has to happen. But we will use the vertical. It has to do with regulation. It has to do with technology. But look, why our cities are congested? Because we don't have the same paradigm of an airport. In airport, we have air traffic controllers. We have very strict regulated landing and takeoff. When you go in a city, a 10 million people city, in China there are 11.
Yeah.
If you don't have a central control and command for your traffic,
Yeah.
and you still have policemen staying at the traffic light with a button, obviously there is something wrong with, there's a big disconnect between the city manager and the products are circulating. So there is a lot to be done in terms of planning, ruling, controlling, and managing. At ground level, before you fly, learn how to do it properly. So there's a lot to be done, but obviously, going back to your stimulus, yes, we will use also air in a vertical dimension.
But I think there's a risk of just pushing the traffic into the air then, pushing
Yeah,
the
yeah,
congestion
which
into
will
the
not
air.
happen, which cannot happen.
So it comes back to
Please
the sort
don't
of
say
fundamental.
cannot, because everybody who says cannot exactly 2 years later gets blown up. So anyway, yeah, please, Ed, finish it.
But it just
Finish
comes
your
back to
point,
the fundamentals of if you just sort of switch everyone from an individual car usership to an individual, flying drone usership, it doesn't really, the congestion won't be on the roads, it will just be in the skies.
Correct.
It comes back to that responsible use of technology again. So it's all about sort of, do we really want to be pursuing a future that makes it easier for people to get from door to door with just using their phone and one sort of mode of transport on their own? It's not, whether it's in the sky or on the roads, it's not going to be good news.
I understand the congestion piece, and I'll make a point, but this gentleman wants to intervene. Yes, sir.
I come from another side of mobility. I'm from Valentine Maritime Gulf. We are primarily into offshore EPC, oil and gas sector. The tagline of our company is "We make things happen."
What happened?
We make things happen.
Oh yeah, okay. That's Valentine's. Okay, nice.
Okay. And the thing about us, we are from the sea, and we have DP2 barges that is running, and these are actually doing survey as well as actual work site, which are having redundancies.
And the question is?
And the point here is that trust.
Oh, okay, right.
Now, here, to get the trust of having a vessel which is slightly autonomous with a man over it, there is 3 levels of redundancy if it's a DP2, DP3 vessel. Like,
no, I get it. So basically saying what level of redundancies do you need to build in to start creating trust? I think it's a rhetorical question. Let me get into smart cities also. We spoke about smart cities. You want to make a question on smart cities? Just a quick comment? Yes, sir. Please.
Alexander from Securo Group. We were speaking about the ethics and trust, and I absolutely agree with the fact that in reality it comes from regulation. It comes to regulation. It comes from regulation. For example, the well-known General Data Protection Regulation in EU. Now everyone is supposed to comply with that, GDPR. And so once all the companies go through this procedure in European Union, we as a company, the platforms that we utilize, we say they're GDPR compliant, and this brings trust with the people and the customers. So I totally agree with the fact that it comes to the regulation as ethics in as a moral conscious comes into the form of being in regulation. Whether right or wrong, whether progressive or not, well, time shows, but regulations do help to build trust.
Okay. Regulations is fine. I'm sort of not too much into the regulation bit, because then it just becomes a different starting point. Let me go to urbanization, gentlemen. And by that I mean is that, and let me throw a really disruptive curveball in there. What if we forget cars the way we have them, and all of this urbanization that's going on, have everything regulated, transported, a grid is working, getting us from point A to B, and there's a lot of conversation about making the urban structures more dense, so the distances of travel are substantially reduced, and we start eliminating cars. You spoke about 2 billion cars. What if the 2 billion goes down to 100 million? In other words, change the game. How do we change the game? Perhaps we are looking at it in a linear form from today into tomorrow, rather than jumping into tomorrow and coming back from there and saying, who needs cars?
Absolutely, and I mean, I think you made a comment earlier about the transition from the horse to the car. I sometimes feel we're in the same situation where everybody just sees horses and sees how we can we advance horses. Yeah, we make them fly. We get flying horses, but we still have a person, 2 people sitting in a flying horse.
We can work on it.
So, which we can probably make work. Yeah. So I think that's great, and I think the opportunities we have with a complete transformation of how mobility works is huge, and we need to build that into cities. For example, we've just been talking about autonomous cars, but there are the e-scooters, there are the sharing, there's the bikes, there is improving walking, of course. There's, like you said, bringing the buildings closer together so you can actually have a more interaction. There's the things where we actually remove the need to do trips in terms of improving logistics, improving the way we work in an office, less meetings, less going to client meetings and so on.
Better land use plans as well.
Exactly. So we need to step out of that kind of very constrained thinking.
Correct,
we need people to get them from A to B, and let's see how we can optimize the mode and get as many people as possible in one vehicle.
Yeah.
And obviously one of the approaches is to urbanization and changing that. But I think that the most critical thing is, and you ask about what the future engineers, planners, skill set needs to be. And ethics is probably an important part of that. But the more important thing is that we actually educate people that can think across disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we were all trained as, we probably both were, I'm sorry for speaking for, as transport planners.
Yeah.
But we get the chance now to think about urban structures. We need to become land use planners. We need to become people who understand social aspects, as the comment was made earlier.
Yeah.
We need to understand how we get feedback from how people behave and feed that into the design process.
And our education system needs to fundamentally change, and people who have got their first degrees and people in this level need to again retrain themselves from there.
Can I add
Yeah.
something to what you
Yes.
were asking? Maybe the number of vehicles have to decrease.
Yeah.
I want to use the case of Singapore.
Yes.
Singapore, 10 years ago, they had over 1 million vehicles. Singapore is a small country, 720 square kilometers. Over 1 million vehicles for 5 million inhabitants. Today, it's 500,000 vehicles. So, and the growth rate in terms of population is almost 0. How they did that? They did that, first of all, by putting strong regulations for not allowing cars to be imported. 100% import duty, raffle situation, and that. But at the same time, and that's easy because any government and public authority can do that. Tomorrow you go and you put limitations. But they, at the same time, created a fantastic and is continuously evolving public transportation system.
Absolutely.
And by giving a public transportation that is not economy class, business class, first class, but it's a public transportation that you are a CEO, you are a blue collar, you go and rub shoulders and you're happy because it's punctual, it's distributed, it's reliable,
Yeah.
it's clean, it's safe, and it's cheap.
Yep.
When you have that, then why do I need a car? And by the way, then they also put a little rule says cars are off limit from this zone, that zone, because you have alternatives. And it's not necessarily a skateboard or a bicycle, because not everybody can ride a bicycle or a skateboard. So it can happen, and if one country like Singapore, and Singapore is a city country, can do it, others can do it. But it takes not only regulations, it takes also planning, it takes legislation, and it takes implementation. And by the way, public transportation is not about number of buses or number of trains or number of kilometers of railway. It's about how you deploy, how you plan, how
Accessible.
everything has to be thought not vehicle-centric, but has to be thought pedestrian-centric, citizen-centric, this person, citizen experience-centric. And that's where the ethics that the automotive industry has one big problem, that they're product-oriented. And they don't care less where the car goes or where the bus goes or where the tractor goes. And that's why the smart mobility, for the first time, is bringing people from different industries, and you are bringing the human factor in it. I was not prepared for that, but basically, this is the very first time that an urban planner is talking to the OEM guy, and the OEM guy is talking to the consultant, and the consultant is talking to the telecommunication, because without 5G, there is not V2X. So this is a real transformation moment, and things will move with different speeds based on the vision and the capability of the regulator of this country to that country.
Fair enough.
And the money also.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Can I just jump-
and I think within this this coalition of conversation, it's wonderful to have Alan, who has a degree in psychology, and this gentleman in anthropology, to understand that human behavior, to become an integral part of that coalition of decision-making, rather than engineers or lawyers or accountants trying to decide what needs to happen, and actually now bring in the soft stuff as an integral part of this future as we build it. We've got about 2 minutes to go. Final comment from you, Jörg and Ed, because I'll treat that as my final comment, please.
Yeah, just to jump on that, and it's bringing the social aspect in, and something we've, just a bit more insights of what we've done very quickly. Coming back to the prediction and forecasting of what's going to happen in the future. We looked at studies that have been done around the world in terms of the impact of autonomous vehicles and others, and we found that a lot of these studies are very constrained in terms of what's the technology, what is the traffic impact, and so on. And this is really where, just to reiterate that aspect of the social impact, the human impact needs to be brought into that a lot more. We actually started speaking to some people from universities who work in social research. And I want to leave you with pretty much a comment that is very much related also to urbanization from Jan Gehl, one of the biggest architects. I mean, he one day said that we know pretty much everything about how the habitat of a gorilla should be formed and should be ideal, but we know very little about the ideal habitat of a human being, because we don't research, we don't ask people, we don't do that kind of level of analysis. And the same applies to mobility, and I think we have to make a step change here and start understanding the human beings a lot more to actually develop cities, smart cities, and the mobility forms of the future in an ideal way for the human beings.
Thank you, Jörg. Final comment, sir?
Final comment would just be to add to your point about Singapore. You know, and an opportunity there just to mention mobility as a service, which is something that we're looking at a lot. And mobility as a service is, you know, mobility is not going to be improved by putting an app in someone's phone. Mobility as a service really fundamentally doesn't work if you don't have public transport. So, Alan, I know you mentioned WIM in Finland. That's failing because there's no market there. They don't have that public transport sort of set up. And the Shahail app in Dubai, you know, really when I look at that, and I go, the idea was to sort of show how easy it would be to get from A to B using other modes of transport. Really all it tells me is actually it's much easier for me to get there by car or by taxi. So it doesn't really work unless you have the sort of well-integrated public transport network. So my sort of closing point is technology and innovation, fantastic, you know, But it's all well and good. You've got to get the basics right first.
Ed, thank you very much, Jörg, and Engineer Bijan. A big hand for the three gentlemen who... Very animated discussion, thank you. Appreciate it, very open.